Did you know CO2 is not the primary greenhouse gas? Did you know polar bears aren't going extinct? We're going to learn about those facts and a lot more tonight, so stay tuned to From the Stacks. Hi, everybody. Welcome to From the Stacks. I'm Megan Kennard, Director of Operations and Communications for the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, standing in for Cal Beisner. We have a special show for you tonight. Gregory Wrightstone, Executive Director of the CO2 Coalition and author of the book Inconvenient Facts, The Science Al Gore Doesn't Want You to Know, which is available from our web store at www.cornwallalliance.org, joins us to give his presentation of global warming, the cold, hard facts. But before we hear from Gregory, I want to remind you all that we're giving away a magnificent report from Inder Goklani titled Impacts of Climate Change, Perception and Reality. This report demolishes claims that burning fossil fuels causes devastating global warming. To receive it, you can ask for promo 21-03 in the comments section when you give a donation of any amount to the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Go to www.cornwallalliance.org and click Donate. The comments box is on the second page of the donation page if you're looking for it. Now I'm going to hand it over to Gregory Wrightstone. Gregory, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Megan. Good to be back on with you again. You know, I think maybe we should, before we get into the presentation, I think it'd be helpful for your listeners to know how, as a geologist, and I'd worked in industry for many years, how did I get into this? And it was an exploration, a search for the truth. I knew as a geologist that some of what we were being told about climate change was just wrong. And that, in particular, that was ocean acidification. I suspected other things were wrong, and I started doing a deep dive into the various aspects of climate change, looking at the various what I call climate apocalypse events. Droughts, floods, not enough snow, too much snow, increasing toenail fungus, you name it. And it was this search for the truth that led me to write Inconvenient Facts, which is it was just within the last 2 weeks, it was still a #1 bestseller in a couple of categories, which was published more than 2 years ago. So that's pretty incredible.
Right.
But it's got some legs.
Book.
And so this was the result of my personal search for the truth. And since then, I'm in the middle of writing my second book, and I joined the CO2 Coalition as executive director in January, and we're a group of 60 of the top 60 plus scientists, some of the top scientists in the world, including physicist Will Happer, physicist Richard Lindzen, Pat Michaels, Patrick Moore, that's just got a new book out. Thank you. And you can learn more at co2coalition.org. Well, without going any further, let's get right into my presentation. It's global warming, the cold hard facts. And we've heard, go ahead, Jim. We've heard that of the 97% consensus, and there is an agreement probably with 97% of the scientists that on a few of these matters. Number one, CO2 has been increasing. Number two, most of the CO2 increase is man-made. And temperature, we're in an increasing temperature anomaly. It's been rising really for more than 300 years. The temperature's risen, it's around 1 degree centigrade since the turn of the century. But there is serious disagreement on a few things. Two things really. Is the increase in temperature primarily due to man-made increases in CO2 and other greenhouse gases? Or is the increase in temperature driven primarily by the same natural forces that have been driving temperatures up and down since the dawn of time? And really the other aspect that doesn't get talked much about is, are these changes that we see from our changing climate, are they harmful or are they beneficial? We'll look at both of these things tonight. my first inconvenient fact that I had in the book, and we're not going to go through all of them, but it's important to see that carbon dioxide, and remember, carbon dioxide is painted, is it not, by the UN and the media as this demon molecule. And we'll learn some things about that in fact it should be considered the miracle molecule. But we're being told that carbon dioxide is the primary greenhouse gas. If we go to the National Geographic, their website, what's their description of greenhouse gases? Includes carbon dioxide, methane, blah blah blah, and not one word. Let's go see what the EPA says. This is from the EPA website. Again, carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases. These conveniently omit the largest greenhouse gas of all, which is water vapor. And why do they do it? It's to overemphasize the effect that carbon dioxide has on the atmosphere and on any warming from increasing carbon dioxide. The pie chart on the left shows greenhouse gases while you admit without carbon dioxide. The pie chart on the right shows what should be the correct pie chart, showing that water vapor makes up some 90% of all greenhouse warming effect. And CO2, while it's not a trace gas and a trace greenhouse gas, it represents a very small amount, right around 5 or 6% of all greenhouse effect. Another important aspect is that the warming effect of each additional increase of CO2 molecule declines as its concentration increases. And by that I mean that the first several hundred parts per million, we're a little over 400 parts per million now, but the first several hundred parts per million provide nearly all the warming that we'll ever see from carbon dioxide. If we would increase carbon dioxide up to 1,000 parts per million. Another way to look at it here would be that the carbon dioxide we've already added makes up 87% of all possible warming between that and 1,000 parts per million. So each additional increase of carbon dioxide, those additional molecules have a smaller and smaller and smaller warming effect on the atmosphere. And I'm okay. I agree that with CO2 increasing, the increase in CO2, it's a greenhouse gas. It necessarily has to have some warming effect on the atmosphere. I would just argue, and so would the CO2 coalition, that it's modest and overwhelmed by those natural forces that have been driving temperatures for thousands and millions of years. And again, just looking at carbon dioxide, just looking at the big picture of whatever's in our atmosphere, the little sliver on the pie chart on the left, that little sliver of yellow, those are the trace gases. Well, carbon dioxide is one of those trace gases, and we'll take a look at those trace gases on the right and find that carbon dioxide at 0.04% is a trace gas of a trace gas. So it's a small amount, but it's an important amount. That CO2 combined with oxygen they're really the building blocks of life on this earth. Without either one of those, life as we know it could not exist. Go ahead. And looking at the Mauna Loa Observatory, where there are a number of places around the world where we measure atmospheric CO2, we can see that CO2 here has been gradually rising somewhat significantly. This goes back to 1958 at Mauna Loa. And what's interesting too, all those 6 blue dots represent the major climate conferences. You know, in each conference they said, we have to slow the rise of CO2. Well, they never, and anything they've done in the past has had absolutely no effect on CO2. And what's interesting too, we just locked down the world. We went through a global COVID lockdown. And you know what it did to atmospheric CO2? Nothing. It continues rising at about almost the same rate as before. And what they're proposing is to do an even more serious lockdown and get us out of we need to stop emitting CO2, they tell us. This is an important chart, and I want you to know as we go through this tonight, older ages are on the left of the chart, going to the modern to the right. Anything you see in blue is carbon dioxide, and anything in red is temperature. So here we have carbon dioxide emissions dating back to 1759. And the important thing I want you to look at here is that we really didn't start adding a lot of CO2 until the mid 20th century or so. It was that post-World War II economic boom, whenever we started really ramping up CO2. So if we're going to see any effect or any significant effect of CO2 driven warming, it'll be in that period from 1950 or so on. So keep that in mind as we're looking through here. And what's the increase in, what's the CO2? What are man's influences? What's causing increases of CO2? It's burning of fossil fuels for the most part, coal, natural gas, and oil. Interestingly, 5 to 6% comes from cement manufacture, and that's because during the process of creating cement, they burn limestone. Well, what's limestone? CaCO3, calcium carbonate. So that carbonate, when it gets converted into cement, it outgasses CO2. So yeah, we're adding by burning fossil fuels, and as we'll find out as we go through this, I'm okay with more CO2. I really am, because we see the many benefits here at the CO2 Coalition, the many benefits of increasing CO2. Here's a chart of the last 400,000 years of CO2 data. And again, the pinkish color there are the interglacial warm periods, and the blue are the, I guess we'll call them the Ice Age advances. So these are on 100,000 year cycles. During each of the previous interglacial periods, and this is why I use geology to prove that the CO2 that we've got in the atmosphere now, something's changed. And that what is that thing that's changed? Is probably burning hydrocarbons. We're liberating the carbon dioxide that was trapped in those rocks and sequestered over many thousands of millions of years. But what we see here is that during each ice age advance, CO2 levels plummeted. They went from usually around 300, 280, 300 parts per million to under 200 parts per million. And it sounds counterintuitive that a cooling ocean sucks up CO2. But think about it. If you had a liter jar of ginger ale and you put that liter jar of ginger ale in your refrigerator and open it up, it would just go. Take that liter jar of ginger ale in August and put it on your patio or your picnic table in the sun in the backyard. Now open it up, and what happens? Man, that thing opens and goes like a volcano. And that's because the warming fluids and liquids and water expel CO2. And that's what happens with that liter jar of ginger ale. As it warms up, the CO2 wants to escape. And that's why we have increases during these interglacial periods. But we see that, again, we're at over 400 parts per million right now. And it's unusually high compared to other interglacial periods. But again, is it dangerous? We'll look into that as we go through. Next. And that's why I say in climate science, that's why the geologic perspective is so important. You're going to see that several times as we go through tonight. So now we just saw 400,000 years of CO2 history that shows that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is dangerously high. Well, is it? Let's take a look now at the longer term perspective, going back to the Precambrian period. We find out that actually looking at today, the blue dashed line at the bottom is our current carbon dioxide level. The red line is what I call the line of death. That's the minimum threshold for plant life to exist, 150 parts per million. And the next chart, we're not going to look there yet, but the next chart will show us one of the most chilling and dangerous and scary charts you're going to see tonight. But again, throughout Earth's history, we've seen that the Paleozoic, we're in the Paleozoic, CO2 levels are average 2,600 parts per million, 6.5 times the levels of what they are today. And again, the scariest chart in the book is this 140 million years of CO2 data. And we see a nearly linear decline of carbon dioxide. And the reason is this carbon was being sucked out as rocks were being deposited, as the shales that we're now liberating, that are being developed by fracking, hydrofracking, and horizontal drilling, as they were being deposited, they were sucking huge amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. For the most part, they were probably fueled by algal blooms that bloomed, and then they would die and fall to the bottom and eventually end up as rocks. Also, limestone. There's huge amounts of limestone that were being deposited. But primarily, I believe it's due to this natural sequestering of the CO2 forming these organic rich rocks that we are now liberating and burning them as fossil fuels. But again, if you look here at the end of the last ice age, we got to 182 parts per million, thought to be one of the lowest levels of carbon dioxide in Earth's history since the Precambrian. We nearly crossed that line of death. We got within a whisker of crossing and almost reaching that 150 parts per million. If we ever got there, that would be a true climate apocalypse. That would be terrible. I don't need to explain how that would go for us. It wouldn't be pleasant. And if you're a climate alarmist, this is a really good chart because, boy, it looks like a great correlation. Again, the red is temperature, the blue is carbon dioxide emissions. Boy, it looks like a real good correlation, but I'll remind you, though, that correlation does not imply causation. We can get a lot of bizarre correlations. We're going to look at this in a longer term perspective, which is needed to do. Too many times they only look at, the alarmists only look at the last 50 or 100 or 150 years of temperature. And of course, this chart goes back to 1850. And again, remember we started adding huge amounts of CO2 in the mid 20th century. So let's take a look at that period from the mid 1940s to present, and we see that about 70% of the time during this period when CO2 levels were rising, we were in either a cooling trend or a stable trend. If CO2 was going to be driving temperatures, it should be just the opposite. And again, if we look at that period, that 30-year period after we started really adding a lot of CO2, what happened to temperature? We started adding CO2. It was dropping like a rock almost. Many of the people in the call may be old enough to remember the late 70s, 1977, 78, 79, really cold years, horrifically cold. And so we went through 30 years of the beginning of this rapid increase of CO2, and all the while it was cooling. And remember, this is that chart that I said that the alarmists love because it looks like a great correlation between CO2 and temperature. Again, let's put this into the longer term perspective, which is the Central England temperature record. Again, red is temperature, blue is carbon dioxide emissions. We see with this chart that the warming trend we're in, yes, we're in a warming trend, but it started in the late 1600s. The end of the 17th century is when it started warming. And we've been warming in fits and starts ever since. But this warming started long before we started adding any amounts of CO2 that could have influenced the temperature. So the first 250 years of our warming trend that we're in right now had to have been almost entirely naturally driven. But we're being told, no, all that changed in the middle of the 20th century, and now it's being driven by carbon dioxide. I'm not buying it, and you won't either in a moment. Let's go to the next one. Now remember, we just looked at data that showed that our warming began in the late 1700s. We're going to look here at global sea level, and then the next slide will be glacial advance or retreat. And those two things go hand in hand. I have to note right now, we are in a warming trend, so glaciers should be retreating. But just bear in mind, we hear a lot of talk about the dangers of melting the northern polar ice cap, but the fact of the matter is, we could melt the entire polar ice cap and it would scarce do a thing to sea level. And the reason for that is that is ice that's floating on water. So as we melt ice in water, it displaces, and it actually doesn't have, it has virtually no effect on sea level. You can do that experiment tonight don't do it now. Do it after we're done with the talk here. But put a few cubes in the ice, mark a level, watch it when it melts. The level remains the same. That's the same theory with the northern polar ice. It's land-based ice, land-based glaciers. When they melt, they contribute to sea level rise. And most of that's locked up in Antarctica and Greenland. But across mainly the northern hemisphere, we've had glacial retreat. And so we take a look here, and this is global sea level rise. And you can see that it started in the mid-1800s, sea level started rising. And let's take a look at glacial retreat. Glacial shortening began also in the mid-1800s. And it's been, the glaciers have been retreating at about the same rate with no acceleration. Again, if we were to see acceleration of glacial retreat when the CO2 is increasing, then that would be evidence to back up some of this man-made argument. We don't see it. We didn't see it with sea level rise. And you might ask, well, Greg, you told me it started warming 100 or 150 years before glaciers started retreating and sea level started. Why is that? Well, that's because it had to warm up enough for summer ice melt to exceed winter ice accumulation, if you follow me. So it wasn't quite warm enough that their glaciers continued advancing until the early 1800s. And it was only when the winter ice accumulation was less than the summer ice melt. And that occurred in the early 1800s. And it's been about the same rate ever since. Go ahead. It's very informative to look back over the last 10,000 years of temperature data, back to the end of the last ice age. And I identified 9 other warming trends previous to our current warming trend. And it's instructive. This is Greenland data. It's instructive to take a look at these. Go ahead. We're being told a couple things. We're being told that our temperatures today are unusual and unprecedented. They're not. We're being told, we just saw that from the previous chart with all those other warming trends, up and down and up and down. We're also being told that the rate of increase of the warming is unprecedented. We've never had this rate of increase. I've seen claims of 20 or 30 times as much rate of increase. There's never been anything close to it. Well, I took a look at that 10,000 years of data at the other 9 warming trends and found that 5 of those 9 previous warming trends were warming at a higher rate of increase than what our current trend is. So it's not unusual. So our temperatures are not unusual. They're not unprecedented, and neither is the rate of warming. Again, looking at our temperature, we're stepping back into time now. We've got, for the last 150, 3.5 million years, we were in glacial cycles, first 41,000 year cycles, and now we're in a 100,000 year cycle. Up and down and up and down and up and down. These are being driven by what's called the Milankovitch cycles, the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit, the wobble of the Earth. And that's what's driving. But overall, we've been in a net decrease of temperature over these last several million years. And again, looking back 65 million years of data, we find that most of this time was much warmer than it is today. In fact, we're living in some of the coldest times in Earth's history right now. It's not too warm compared to much of Earth's history. It's very cold, And in fact, most of the time over this last 60 plus million years, there wasn't even any ice at the Antarctic. And it's only a recent event that we had polar ice at the northern pole. Well, geologically recent. Good. And again, we'll take another longer look, if you will. You'll see that the temperatures here fluctuated from what's called hothouse conditions, where it was really warm, and icehouse conditions like we're in right now, where we cycled in and out of glacial events and glacial ages. And so we are in an icehouse event in what's called the Quaternary period. One of my favorite things I like to talk about is the relationship between the rise and fall of temperature and the rise and fall of civilizations. Each of the previous warm periods, we saw that humanity prospered. These warm periods were warmer than they are today. Great civilizations rose up, and life was good. Food was bountiful. Food was plentiful. If you were Empress Megan in a warm period, well, and I think you'd make a very good Empress Megan, but I think you would, you were pretty safe. You could feed your subjects, and they would love you because they had lots of food. But if you were Empress Megan in a period that was cooling, you probably wouldn't be Empress very long, because crops, when it's, each time we saw the temperature started dropping, we saw that crops failed, famine set in, pestilence, and mass depopulation. For example, the Minoan warm period, back to the time some of the great civilizations, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, empires in India and Asia, these great empires, first empires arose, and then within about a 100-year period, at the end of this Minoan warm period, they had what was called the Late Bronze Age collapse, probably associated to climate cooling, which then led to centuries of these Greek Dark Ages. And then it got better in the Roman warm period. There was a reason the Romans wore togas. It was really warm. And again, life was good. People had time to tinker, to dream, to sculpt, to invent. And they did. Great civilization. Then once again, it started cooling down, went into the Dark Ages. And finally, the medieval warm period. This is the time of the High Middle Ages. And then it got cold again. We went into the Little Ice Age, and we'll just dive here just into something that's pretty interesting, but it serves a point. There were witch hunts of Europe in the late Middle Ages that were pretty severe. Some 50,000 supposed witches were killed. And what we find is that as the medieval warm period started cooling and going into the Little Ice Age, it led to, once again, crop failure, famine, pestilence, and mass depopulation. People started dying. We saw societal collapse, and they blamed it on weather causing witches. And they started killing them in quite a bit of numbers. Pope Pius issued a papal bull in the 15th century stating, yes, there are weather causing witches, and if you find them, you should kill them, and boy, they did. Well, it's interesting, around 1500, it warmed up again, and crops came back. Life was good, and they attributed it. So what caused the warming and the increase in crops? Come on. Yeah, they killed all the witches. You got it. That's what they said. They said, boy, we did really good. We killed all the witches, and now life is good. But that only lasted for about 40 years, and then it really started getting cold. And that's when the really horrific witch hunts took place. In fact, in my upcoming book, here's a chart. I've got the number of witches killed per decade at the top, and temperature, really cold temperatures, the number of extremely cold months on the bottom. So there was a real correlation. But again, isn't it just opposite? And the point here is, isn't it just opposite of what we're being told? We're being told, oh my God, we can't let it get another 2 degrees warmer, or we're going to have famine and we're all going to die. No, that's not what history tells us. History tells us, welcome the warmth, fear the cold. And we'll look at the climate apocalypse events. I live in the real world. I look at what's actually happening today. When we talk, and the people that are promoting catastrophic man-made warming, they point to what may or may not happen in the future. So if you hear somebody talking and it's a study that starts out and they use the words might, may, or could, immediately suspect it. Because it might not, it could not. They don't go the other way. So I look at what's actually happening today. And we find here, this is Roy Spencer, he took a look at climate models versus actual warming. I'm sure many of you that have seen this chart many times. He found that modeled temperatures over predict warming by 2.5 times too much, 3 times too much in the tropics. And then they're using this. We're going to go through two examples of climate, how climate science is being misused. The first was a 2019 report from the UN that came out that said that there would be 1 million species at risk of extinction. And it was met with headlines just like this. It was just terrible. And this was the chart included in the book. Now, look carefully. This chart only has 1 data point per century. And there's a reason they did that. I looked at the exact same data from the IUCN Red List. And what we found, I looked on it a decadal by decadal basis. And we find that actually extinctions have been in significant decline dating back to the late 1800s. There's no question that man was responsible for a lot of extinctions back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, mainly from introducing species on these island nations. You introduce a rat and it wipes out populations of birds. But to get to 1 million extinctions over several decades, you would need to have 25,000 to 30,000 species go extinct every year. Every year, 25,000 to 30,000. What's it been over the last 40 years? Two extinctions per year over the last 40 years. Not 25,000. Oh, well, we're going to get there pretty quick. No, we're not. And it just irritates me. They tortured the data to get where they did. And the big study, the conclusion of this report should have been, we're doing a really, really good job protecting our endangered species. And they came up with just the opposite based on tortured data. The other big thing we hear about is fire. This is the 4th National Climate Assessment, which was a packet of alarmist, there was good data in the technical session, but this is the summary report. And it was bad. They featured fires on the front and back of the report. This is the chart they used in the report for the United States, an increase in the United States wildfires. They didn't source it. And I looked at that. This is area burn. I said, I've seen that before, but it didn't look right. And finally, I got back and go ahead, let's look at the next one. This is the entire chart where they took this data from. They cherry picked the most recent data and then blew it up at a scale to make it look incredible. What you see when we look back at the entire scope of the data back to 1928, that area burned in the United States is currently at some 20% of what it was 100 or 80 years ago. We've actually had yes, there has been an increase in area burned slightly, but nothing like we'd seen 80, 90 years ago. And again, we'll take a look at this chart. I added CO2 to it here. But again, there's a lot of area in the United States that's burning a lot less. And also, if we look at the number of forest fires in the U.S., we also see a tremendous decline. And if we look at, this is probably one of the largest studies of global forest fires by Yang and a team led a team of fires to examine all over the world. We saw pretty significant and steady decline of fires. It's thought that this decline in fires is actually due to CO2 fertilization effect, part of it. And that means that as CO2 increases, plants need less water because they're not breathing in and out as much. They don't have to, it's called transpiration. And this report was by a large study looking at global warming and global fires around the world from the Canadian Fire Service. And I'm going to read this. This is important. We believe that global warming since 1850 may have triggered decreases in fire frequency and may lead to further decreases in fire. Isn't that again, completely opposite of everything you've heard about fires? We're being told global warming's aggravating the fires, and that the experts tell us that's just not true. And again, we talk about the CO2 fertilization effect. This is Dr. Craig Edso, another CO2 coalition member, showing what the effects of various levels of CO2 can do to this particular type of tree. And we're seeing that throughout the earth. We're leading to a rising soil moisture. We talked about that earlier, leading maybe to a decrease in forest fires. So we have also, with rising temperatures, we can expect some increase in water vapor, maybe an increase in precipitation, which helps. And just think about too, CO2 fertilization lowers the plant's water needs and leading to a greening of the earth. According to NASA, up to 50% of the earth is greening. In other words, vegetation's increasing. According to Zoo here, less than 4% of the earth is what he calls browning, or loss of vegetation. It's a huge, great story. And associated with this, we're seeing the driest parts of the globe increasing in vegetation. There's areas where deserts are shrinking, not expanding. There's an area of the southern Sahara called the Sahel that's turning a former desert into a lush grassland. Animals are moving back there in their gazelles, even amphibians are moving back in. And again, from Dr. Craig Idso and his team, they did a laboratory study of what a 300% increase in crop growth would do to crops. We would see, if that increase in CO2, we'd see a 46% increase in crop growth, crop biomass. That's a good thing. That's a thing that you should celebrate. That is really, really good. We'll be able to feed the hungry. And a lot of it's being driven by an increase in CO2. And we should celebrate that. Again, this is from UN FAO study of cereal grains around the world. We're breaking records year after year after year. CO2 is increasing, temperature is increasing. Temperature increases are leading to benefits in food and crop growth. Just think about it. With a warming planet, we have longer growing seasons. Killing frosts stop earlier in the spring and arrive later in the fall. We can get more plantings in. And then CO2's turbocharging plant growth. We're being told that droughts are increasing. We look at these long-term studies. I've only included one here, but long-term studies that say no, no, no. Droughts are not increased, they're actually in decrease. And we're also being told that global warming is going to kill a lot of people. People are going to die because of global warming, man-made driven warming. There's nothing that could be further from the truth. The largest study of its kind was done by Dr. Antonio Gasparini. He looked at 74 million deaths, temperature-related deaths around the world. He concluded that cold kills 20 times more people than heat. Another study I captured, they looked at England and Wales and Australia, and in that study they said it was 15 times. Well, if it's 15 or 20, whatever that number is, there's a lot more people die from cold than due to heat. So I think you're pretty safe if you make the statement, global warming will save lives. When they do that, heads explode. And again, we're being told extreme weather deaths. Beware, we're all going to die from extreme weather. There was a new revision to this chart. This chart shows a 98% decline in extreme weather-related deaths in the U.S. The update to this showed it was 99% decline in extreme weather-related deaths. So, just in summary here, efforts to slow CO2 emissions, number one, are based on flawed computer models that exaggerate warming. And number two, the increase in CO2 is an overall benefit. These schemes to mitigate CO2 are harmful. I conclude my book by encouraging people, and at the time Donald Trump was in office, I encouraged him to have the courage to do nothing. Take common sense precautions. If you're in an area that may be vulnerable to another 6 or 7 inches of sea level rise, build a seawall. But don't spend another $100 trillion or whatever it might be to cure and fix a non-existent problem. I'm going to leave you with this, a little humor at the end. And Megan, I guess we can open this up to questions.
Megan, your mic is muted.
I can't hear you. I can talk.
Can you?
There
Okay.
you go.
Okay. Oh, you can hear me now?
I can hear you
Right.
now.
Okay. Great. I have a question for you about crop yields. You had a specific graph in there about the increase of crop yields for CO2. The Cornwall Alliance on March 25th every year has a day of prayer for the environment and the poor on Norman Borlaug's birthday because he was the father of the Green Revolution. So our viewers are particularly interested in CO2's impact on crop yields. So I wondered if you could just expand on that a little bit for us.
Yeah, well, let's just say the Cornwall Alliance, of course, is a Christian group, and I am also a Christian, and there's a Christian component to this. I think that for the most part, that if we were harming the earth by our actions, then we have a responsibility for being good stewards. And if indeed CO2 was driving terribly harmful consequences to the earth and its population, we should act and do something about that. I just don't see any evidence of that occurring. We shouldn't take this precautionary principle because it might or could or it may do something. You should, if we're going to be harming the poorest among us the most, which is what carbon taxes and the proposals coming out of the Biden administration now to increase energy costs for everybody. And again, when you increase energy costs, that affects the poorest among us the most. And we can also see other effects of what these proposals will do. They want to rein in fossil fuel coal-fired development, and that means people in India and Africa that are now cooking over in-home indoor fires over dry dung and wood. There are 4 million early deaths because of that. Cataracts are those are 4 million deaths we could easily spare by developing and providing reliable, abundant, and affordable energy to people living in squalid poverty and generational poverty across Africa and India.
And those are 4 million a year, or?
Yes, that's according to the UN. And those
tragic.
Those are 4 million deaths could easily be spared. Let them cook over either fossil fuel fired electricity, and that's what Prime Minister Modi is doing in India. He wants to electrify India and make it 100% electrified, or let them cook with compressed natural gas, propane, or other things like that would not be nearly as harmful. I saw reading a story of a 42-year-old woman in Nepal that was nearly blinded with cataracts, and it was because she was cooking over wood, dried dung, and we don't hear about those people.
It's also not those people who are the ones calling for a lack of fossil fuel use. It's always people with electricity who seem to think we shouldn't be using fossil fuels.
Yeah, we're leading. There's some really dangerous things coming up that are being proposed. During the run up to the election, I was kind of shaking my head. Oh, they're not really going to do that, are they? Well, they are, and it's going to be very expensive for us. It's going to be economically crippling. What they're talking about, our standard of living is up here, and the other standard of living is down here. Well, what we should try and do is lift the other standard of living up here. But I think what the goal is they want to bring our standard of living down to meet what the lower standard is. I want a much higher standard. And again, CO2 everything goes back to CO2. Everything goes back to this demonization of the CO2 as this demon molecule. And one of our main founding goals of the CO2 Coalition was to promote the many benefits of CO2 and what it's having on the earth and humanity.
Thank you so much for what you're doing, Gregory, and for presenting this to our viewers. With COVID having shut down so many events last year, it's really awesome for us to be able to offer this to everyone so that they can see it without having to travel or be in a room with people. So thank you so much. We do, again, have our Day of Prayer coming up, March 25th. If you'd like to learn more about that, sign up for our email newsletter, which is on, you can sign up for that on our website at www.cornwallalliance.org. And we send out an email once, twice, 3 times a week, depending what's going on. We also send out reminders for this live stream. So if you'd like to hear more from us, sign up there. And thank you so much for joining us on From the Stacks. We appreciate your viewership.